This demonstration is about using printmaking techniques when making an illustration. Now, I am not a printmaker, so these techniques are being used to my benefit in terms of how I want to make my image and what will serve the purpose the best. So in this case, this demo is going to utilize analog traditional print techniques and then bringing them into the computer to then further manipulate, to add color, to size, to clean up, things of that nature. So that's my disclaimer. But I've got a couple different types of techniques that I want to share with you. One is a monoprint or a monotype technique, and the other is a variation of block printing or relief printing. So let's get started. As with any project, I like to look for inspiration, so in this case I'm looking at German Expressionist woodcuts. Technique number 1, monoprint or monotype. With the brayer, I've taken the ink and rolled it out on a piece of just about 1/8 inch thick plexiglass. And now I'm taking a note card and I'm drawing with it, and I'm basically removing the ink. I'm using a pencil to bring in some line work, and it's a really interesting technique. Pull the print, you can see there's some really interesting stuff that happens. Here's the piece of plexi with some of that ink removed with the pencil and the note card, and the resulting image is really exciting. I think it's some of those things that can happen when you're not expecting them. The next step is to let the print dry, then scan it into Photoshop. Here I'm just importing it right directly into Photoshop from my flatbed scanner. And now I'm going to adjust the levels in Photoshop, which basically I'm going to increase the contrast between the lights and the darks. Now I have my image ready to go, and I'm going to take this image and I'm going to import it into Adobe Fresco, and there's a number of ways you can do that. Right now I'm just going to take this image and I've got it in there, and I'm just going to start playing around with some color. I've put it on a separate layer. The black ink layer is on a separate layer above the color layer, so right now I'm going in and I am applying some color, as you can see, and just playing around with some different brushes and seeing what's going to happen. The beauty of monoprinting lies in its spontaneity and its allowance for combinations of printmaking, painting, and drawing. As for my color inspiration, I've always been drawn to the strong colors and the fierce brushwork of Fauvism. Now that I've established my color and some highlights, I'm going back in with a black brush and knocking in some areas to define the face a little bit more, and just play around and try to mimic some of those marks that I made with the monoprint. And I think it's matching up pretty well. And then I'm going back in, of course, with a little bit more color along with the black, and just kind of working it back and forth until I get it to a point where I like it. And at this point I feel like it's finished, and I'm just throwing in a little shadow there in the background, trying to keep this really loose, and I'm pretty happy with it. And now that I have an image that I'm happy with, thus concludes technique number 1. And let's move into technique number 2. Technique number 2, relief printing or block printing. This is a poster I made for the American Jazz Museum series of festivals, and this utilizes the block printing technique. As with any illustration, I start out with a sketch, and in this case I'm just going to do a simple portrait, so there is no really concept to this piece other than just doing a portrait of a face. As I'm drawing, I'm keeping in mind the lights and darks, blacks and whites, the areas that will be cut away as I cut into the material, as you'll see in a moment. So this is imperfect. In this case, this is an imperfect process in that the material I'm going to be using today is pretty soft, so the pieces are going to come out a little less precise than as you would on a linoleum block or a piece of wood. And as you can see, this material right here that I'm going to be utilizing is very soft. It's almost like a rubber eraser. Here, this is the actual linoleum block, which is a little more precise, and you can hold a line a little tighter, like the image of the poster that I showed you earlier. So getting back to this stuff, it's pretty flexible, and I'm going to use it to do this demonstration. And the nice thing about it is I can just burnish or rub down the drawing from my piece of paper, and it transfers really easily onto this material. Now that I've got my piece transferred, I'm going to go back in now and to start to cut it away. And I'm using a couple tools. I'm using Speedball makes a tool, the blue handled tool there, that just popped up, and that has a lot of extra nibs and cutting edges inside the handle. Now I'm using a wood carving tool, Flex Cut, which actually works really well, and it's a line tool. Essentially, I think it's called a V tool, and I'm just cutting in some of those areas into the material. And as I mentioned, this material is super soft, so basically the idea is that you can move pretty quickly with it. And in the case of an illustrator, usually on a tight deadline, this material works really well because you can get in and out and make your image fairly quickly. I'm now switching out to another blade that will cut and remove the material a little more quickly, and it will also make a slightly different mark, which will be interesting when we get around to inking this block. Now the fun part, let's ink this block. I'm spreading out some ink on a plexiglass palette, and I'm taking a brayer and I'm inking my piece. I'm taking a wooden spoon. I am pulling my prints. I am not a printmaker, as I mentioned, so I'm going to be okay with a lot of the imperfections that are going to be happening with these prints. So I'm going to pull a few and see which one I like the best. As with the previous technique, I'm scanning these prints into Photoshop, and I'm going to take them in, and then I'm going to do a similar treatment as before. I'm going to adjust the levels, increase the contrast of the prints, and get those blacks and whites really as crisp as I can. And that's the nice thing about using the computers. You can come in there and start playing around with that a little bit more. Actually, I'm going to sharpen this up a little bit too. A little variation on this one is I'm going to knock out that white background. I've now brought up the layer style window, and I'm going to play around with that blending slider. As you can see, I slide it to the left and right. It shows that the white drops away, and so I'm going to slide it over to the left, get rid of that white, and then I make an extra layer and then I put my black layer on top of that, and then I merge them down together. This is a little trick. So then now that layer is totally transparent of any white, and the only thing that is on that layer now is the black ink piece that I have made. And to test that, I'm just going to make a blank layer, and I'm going to drop a little blue in there, and as you can see, that blue is on a layer beneath the black print, and it has knocked away all the white. All right, time to bring this back into Adobe Fresco, and I just brought them in as a Photoshop file. And again, you can see on that top layer is my inked or block print, or whatever you want to call it, my relief print, and I'm underneath playing around with some color. On the right side of these two images, I'm just playing around with kind of a rough brush or with some color, obviously, and just playing around with what that might look like. Now I'm moving over to the left one, and here, now this addresses what I did earlier. I've locked the pixels, and so now when I brush, actually I'm painting on the actual black block print layer, and it's only impacting the actual black areas with the color. Now I've worked back under with an underlying color as well. And here are a couple quick little techniques for you. This was a really fun one to put together. I love printmaking, and I love utilizing those techniques into illustration. Feel free to come by and say hi at these different locations. And I also have my YouTube channel where I have been posting these videos. Please come and check those out as well. Thanks for watching.